Welcome to the Bridgehead with Jonathon Van Maren, bringing you cutting-edge news, commentary, and interviews from the front lines of the culture wars.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Bridgehead on AM 530 at 1:30 p.m. My name is Jonathon Van Maren, and I'll be your host for the next half an hour. Now, any of you who have been following the news for the last week or two will have noticed that there's been a lot of discussion about the history of civil rights in the United States. A lot of discussion about the civil rights movement. It was recently Martin Luther King Jr. Day, which of course came with a lot of different ceremonies and a lot of different historical discussions about the legacy of civil rights and where we are with civil rights. But when I take a look at the civil rights movement, especially in my line of work as an activist, what I like to do is to take a look at the individual stories, because one of the things that we find about great injustices like segregation was, and segregation had been in place more or less since the Reconstruction after the American Civil War in the late 1860s, is that people take a look at an injustice this big and their assumption is that they can't do anything, that, that they're too small, that they don't have enough talent, that the injustice is too big, and there's just really nothing that they can do. But looking at little stories shows us that great injustice brings opportunity for great actions, insofar as that we cannot dictate the injustices of our times, but we can dictate what our reactions to those injustices are. And the woman I had the privilege of interviewing today is someone that I first saw on an extremely famous painting. Norman Rockwell is actually one of my favorite artists. I have a lot of his paintings hanging in my house. I have a book of his paintings. I always thought that he captured very well the sort of idyllic 1950s ideal in the United States, showing kids playing in the field and building tree houses and fishing in the pond. But he has a couple of much more dramatic paintings, of much more gripping paintings. One of them actually shows a murdered African American in Mississippi, but another one of them, probably one of his most famous paintings, is of a little 6-year-old African American girl and flanked by federal marshals. And on the wall behind her, you see a splattered tomato, a racist expletive scrawled on the wall in blood red. And that little girl's name was Ruby Bridges. Now, on November 14, 1960, the first day that black children were given permission to attend the same schools as white children, Ruby Bridges went to school, and she went to a desegregated, or I should say newly integrated school for the first time, and she faced so much hatred and so much viciousness that federal marshals had to protect this girl from shrieking and yelling crowds of racists who were so infuriated that this little girl wanted to attend a school and get the same quality of education as everyone else. Now, I don't want to tell too much of her story because I was privileged to get a hold of Ruby Bridges earlier this week and have a discussion with her about her story. And she talked to me about what it was like to be the only African-American girl in an all-white school, what it was like to essentially brave this racist gauntlet of yelling people, and what it was like to have her family face persecution just for the right to get a basic education. So without further ado, I'd like to share with you the story of Ruby Bridges. To get started, if you could just tell our listeners a bit about your story. You were the only African-American girl attending a school that was newly desegregated.
Absolutely. On November the 14th, 1960, the public school systems here in New Orleans were integrated, and I was one of 4 6-year-old girls chosen to desegregate 2 public schools in New Orleans. And so 3 girls attended one school together, and I attended William Frantz Elementary alone. I was escorted by federal marshals every day that drove me to and from school and actually escorted me into the building and stayed outside my classroom the whole day for a year.
There's famous pictures and of course, a famous painting by Norman Rockwell of the sheer amount of hatred that you had to walk through just to go to sort of a gauntlet of people screaming. What was that like for someone so young?
Well, living here in New Orleans, I'm accustomed to Mardi Gras, and hopefully your listeners are aware of what Mardi Gras is in New Orleans. It's a huge celebration where the whole city is shut down and there are parades in the streets. So growing up in that kind of environment, the first day of school when I turned the corner and I saw, mobs of people standing outside of my school and police officers, everywhere, I actually thought, we had stumbled onto a parade. And that was just the innocence of a 6-year-old child.
How did you react when you found out that those people were actually angry at you just for wanting to go to school?
That didn't really kick in for me until, what did happen. I should back up. I should say that what did happen every day when I was escorted into the building, I spent the whole day in an empty classroom with a single teacher that came from Boston to New Orleans to teach me, because lots of teachers actually quit their jobs. They didn't want to teach black kids. And so the very first day of school, as I was being escorted into the building, I sat in the principal's office all day because all of those people that were outside of the school, they rushed inside of the building and they went into every classroom and they pulled out every child. So over 500 kids withdrew from school the very day that I entered the building. And so I spent the majority of my time searching for the kids. I mean, I went to school every day and I, was in this empty classroom, but I knew that kids were supposed to be in school, and yet this school seemed so different because I was the only child. Little did I know that there were maybe 5 or 6 other kids. They were white, and their parents had to cross that same mob every day to get their kids into the building. And even though they sent their kids, the principal would take those children and she would hide them so that they would never see me and I wouldn't see them. So that whole year was very, very lonely for me, and I didn't realize that there were a few kids stashed away in the building. I could hear them, but I could never see them. So eventually my teacher was constantly going to the principal and threatening to report her to the superintendent for hiding those children. And so I was eventually brought to where those kids were, and a little boy said to me, "I can't play with you. I can't play with you because you're a nigger." And once he said that, I think all of the pieces kind of came together for me. I realized that, it was about me and the color of my skin, and I realized that that's why all the people were out there. So it took a while, but finally, I understood what it was all about.
It was an extremely turbulent time. This is 1960, so sort of right in the very heart of the civil rights movement. The first Civil Rights Act hadn't even been signed yet by President Johnson. What made your parents decide to put you forward as one of the first African-American children in a desegregated school?
My parents came from Mississippi. When you talk about, being in the heart of the civil rights movement, truly Mississippi, Alabama, all of the southern states were, some of the worst places to be during that time. But that's where I was born, and that's where my parents were from, and they were sharecroppers. They were not allowed to attend school if they had to get the crops in and work. And so neither one of my parents had a formal education. My mother, I believe, went to probably 7th or 8th grade, and my father only had a 6th grade education. And so when they heard that their children might have an opportunity to have a better chance at going to college and a better education, I think that that's what they wanted for their children. So they were not activists. They were everyday, ordinary people, very poor. Even at 6, I already had probably 5 other siblings. And so I think it was just something that they wanted so badly for their children that they decided to go through with it.
Were they aware that there would be such a cost to that action at the time that they decided to send you off to school?
I don't think that they were aware at all. I have to say that I do remember my mother talking about how the NAACP, who was the organization that was spearheading this movement across the country, along with Dr. King, that they'd come and visit with her and said that there might be some repercussions, but they really didn't know what to expect. I think that they were told that the president would be sending in federal marshals because they knew that there had been problems in other parts of the country, but they had no idea that this would end up, happening for such a long period of time, for a whole year, that people would be threatening to harm them. My father was fired from his job. He was a service station attendant where he worked on cars, a mechanic, and he was fired from his job. His boss told him that all of his customers knew that it was his daughter going to this white school, so he let him go. The street that we lived on, you couldn't come onto the street. It was blocked off and monitored by federal marshals. They got lots of bomb threats. So I don't think they expected that at all.
How did your dad react to, realizing that his little girl was getting yelled and screamed at for no reason? That must have been pretty hard for a father to handle.
I think it was very hard for my dad. And my father was really against sending me to the school. My mother convinced him. And I think the reasons why my father, again, as you just said, most fathers with their children, their role is the head of the household and to protect. But my father had also been to war. He fought in the Korean War. And having experienced all of that, he said you could go to war and you could be on the front line, serving your country. But if you were black, which he was, then you were still just a colored soldier. You could be on the front line, fighting with a fellow white soldier, but you couldn't go back to the same barracks. And you couldn't eat in the same mess hall. They were still separated, even at war, fighting for the same country. So he felt like, why send me to the school? That it really wasn't going to change things. And so he was against it. And the NAACP advised him not to escort me to school, that my mother should do it, because they thought it would be hard for a father to restrain himself if they were actually threatening to harm me. And so I really wasn't allowed to escort me to school. And my mother did, and even with her, she was only able to do it, 3 or 4 times. And then after that, I was escorted alone by federal marshals.
And I can see why, because you've written in the past that one of the things that scared you the most is when a woman in the mob brought a coffin, and there was a little black doll in that coffin. But you also say that one of the things that helps you to remain calm during this very turbulent year was the fact that you would pray for the people who were screaming at you.
That's very true. They would come to school. First of all, they would come every day and get off buses. And they were boycotting. So they would march in front of the school every day from the beginning of school until school closed. And I would have to pass them to get through the crowd inside of the building because they were standing in front of the building. And even though I had federal marshals, there were times when they would bring the small coffin, and inside was this black doll that they dressed up and put in the coffin. And so whenever I remember being frightened, it was whenever I saw the coffin, because I used to have nightmares about it. And so my mom would always say, if I'm not with you and you're afraid, you can always say your prayers. And I believed in my prayers, because whenever I would have those nightmares, if I said my prayers and prayed, the nightmares would go away. And so I believed that, I should pray for them. She would always jokingly say, those people are crazy, they need praying for. And I took it literally, so I would, say my prayers before school and after school. And if I forgot to say them, I would go back and say my prayers. And I think even then, even though I wasn't aware of it, but I so believed in prayer. I think that was just building my faith. I didn't realize it now, but now being 60 years old, I absolutely stand on my faith and believe in the power of prayer.
You said that one of the most important things you learned actually was how faith became so important to you, and helped you realize personally what the message of the Civil Rights Movement was as well, was that everybody is a unique human being created by God, and this is why everyone should be equal in the first place.
I really did. I mean, I think what I can honestly say to you that what really helped me kind of form those beliefs is it was very easy for me to get past the mob and inside of the building, but every day there was a white woman there to greet me who absolutely loved me. Children know when they're being loved, and I knew that she really cared for me. She made school fun. She did everything imaginable in that classroom to keep my mind off of what was going on outside. I loved school so much, I never missed a day. And so it was easy for me to look at her and see that she looked exactly like the mob outside. She was, she was white as well, but she was different. She was different. She wasn't mean and hateful, and, she showed me her heart. And I knew at that point that even though she looked like them, she wasn't like them. And I think that is the lesson that shaped me into who I am today. Looking at her, I knew that I couldn't judge her the same way as I could judge the people outside. And so it was easy to take away from that experience the message that Dr. King has tried to instill in all of us, that you should never look at a person and judge them by the color of their skin, but you absolutely have to allow yourself an opportunity to get to know that person. The color of your skin has nothing to do with your heart. And I think that is so prevalent today. I think we are being divided across the country, across the world. We are being divided. But I don't think it has anything to do with the color of our skin. I think that we are being divided by good and evil. And we see examples of that all across the world. It is good and evil that's dividing us. And evil will use any one of us. Evil does not care what you look like. And so my philosophy is, if we are about what's good, why should we care? If you are a good person and you and I are of like minds, it doesn't matter to me what you look like. I want you on my team. And I think it's time that we look around the world and understood that we are being divided, and it is good and evil, and we need to choose a side.
And that teacher you mentioned who did choose a side, her name was Barbara Henry. Why?
Barbara Henry.
You still are in contact with her, you still speak with her. Why did she, of all the teachers in the whole school, dedicate herself to teaching one child, and doing so in a fashion that she knew would threaten her teaching career?
Barbara actually came from Boston. She came from the north to New Orleans because her husband was in the military and stationed here in the South, and she was looking for a teacher's position. But she had been accustomed to teaching different nationalities because she had also taught in military bases, teaching those kids. And so she was not a prejudiced person. It didn't matter to her what I looked like. And so she took the job. And, as she said, she said it was a love story for her, that the minute she laid eyes on me, she just kind of fell in love with the child, and that we were in that classroom and in our own world. And it had nothing to do with the hatred that was going on outside. And that's her story. And, I felt it. And my experience was very different from, I would have to say, the other three girls that integrated the other school. They didn't have that same kind of teacher. So, I understand that love can prevail over evil and hatred.
When did you really understand the historical significance of what it was that you were doing? Because obviously you were far too young to realize the significance of being the first African-American child in a white school. But when did you first realize that the name Ruby Bridges would show up in all the histories of the Civil Rights Movement?
I didn't realize that. I mean, after that year was over, I think pretty much people just wanted to forget it. And so it was kind of swept under the rug and never discussed pretty much in the city. My parents ended up divorcing by the time I was in 7th grade. And so it wasn't really discussed in my household. So I grew up, still very poor, very ordinary life. I knew that there was something better outside of my own community, but I didn't have access to that. And so not until I was probably about 18 or 19 years old did I even see the famous Norman Rockwell painting. And at that point, a reporter explained to me, that it was me and that it was Norman Rockwell and how important it was. And I think it made sense again at that point that this wasn't something that just happened in my own neighborhood, that it was something that the whole world watched unfold and that it was significant and it did have meaning. But that didn't happen for me right away.
What happened when you did realize it?
I realized it, and at that point I think it gave me something to strive for. I then realized that, there was a way out of my neighborhood that was poor and poverty-stricken. And I think it just gave me the drive that I needed to pursue that, to pursue something better. And I wanted to, get outside of my community to see the wider world. And so I thought the only way to do that is to become a flight attendant or a travel agent.
Right.
I mean, that was as far as my mind could grasp at the time. And so I ended up going to school and studying travel and tourism and landed a job with American Express and became a travel counselor, which afforded me the opportunity to travel and see the world. And so I thought that what I should do is seize on that opportunity and travel abroad, and I did that. And so it pretty much, it showed me that, the world was much, much bigger than the Ninth Ward in New Orleans. And again, it helped shape me into the person I am today. It allowed me an opportunity to meet different people from all over the world. And, it just continued to instill in me that, the color of your skin and where you come from has nothing to do with your heart. And so not until I was probably about 30 years old, after being married and had kids of my own, did I kind of go back to my history. And I wanted to work with kids, and I wanted to spread my message across the country. And I guess the rest is history, and that's what I'm doing today.
What's the message you bring to people when you go and speak to them?
Well, the majority of my time is spent in schools, and because my experience comes from that of a child, I felt like I wanted to work with kids. I remembered that little boy saying that he couldn't play with me because his mom said not to. It made me understand that racism is something that we're not born with, that it's something that's passed on to us.
Right.
And if it starts with kids, then I think that's where I should start, is trying to shape that message in them. And so I'm in schools. I tell my story. I tell other stories of the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement wasn't just about black and white against one another. There were black and whites that came together, that fought together, and some of them died together so that we all could have equal rights. The way history is taught here in the States is that, it's still one-sided. And I believe that, it's not just black history, it's our shared history. It should be taught that way. And And so that's what I do in schools. And then I kind of open it up for them to talk to me and to ask me questions. And so I think that I have an opportunity to see hope that most people don't see, because I see it in our young people in schools across the country. So my message basically is, you know, racism has no place in the hearts and minds of our children, that we absolutely need to give each other a chance to get to know one another, because you'll never know when and who you will need at any given time.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time to share your story with us.
Well, I appreciate you being interested in it, and I do hope that your listeners enjoyed it, and I hope that we all take the opportunity to understand that it is good and evil. It has nothing to do with the color of our skin.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was Ruby Bridges, one of the first African-American children to attend a newly desegregated or integrated school, sharing with us the story of the civil rights and giving us just one personal testimony out of a huge and courageous movement that brings so many stories like this. We're hoping to go through a lot of different stories over the next couple of weeks. I'm going to be traveling overseas, but I've managed to conduct a lot of interviews with people who responded with great courage to very difficult circumstances and just did what they could to stand up for their neighbors, and how those actions had a tremendous ripple effect and save lives. We hope you enjoyed this interview, and we hope you'll consider joining us again next week. Thanks so much for listening, and have a great weekend.